Now we'll move on to the second form of American law, constitutional law. Constitutional law is simply law that interprets and applies the U.S. Constitution. Like common law, it is judge-made law, and it comes from the resolution of disagreements over the meaning and application of the Constitution. Also, like common law, it rarely changes. Stare decisis holds fast in constitutional law. To really understand constitutional law, though, you have to understand the Constitution itself and how it came to be. So I'll begin with a brief discussion of U.S. history and the making of the Constitution. A good bit of what I say was also covered in the video that you should have watched, the Magna Carta and the Constitution. So while America was still just a collection of colonies, the colonies had local governments. These local colonial governments answered to the English Parliament and the King of England. Many of the colonial governments were organized through charters, and the king granted to the colonists, charters that the king granted to the colonists to claim and cultivate the land in the name of the King of England. Well, the colonists grew dissatisfied with the government in England for failing to address many of their concerns, such as taxation, the presence of British troops still in the colonies even after the French and Indian War. That dissatisfaction, plus the Enlightenment philosophies of John Locke and others, led the colonists to revolt, peaceably at first. So before independence, colonial delegates, calling themselves the Continental Congress, instructed the colonies to write a constitution for themselves to establish their state government. So these state constitutions came years before the U.S. Constitution. The separate colonies thereby became separate states. They were connected to one another only loosely. They were not interested in having a strong national government that might act like just another parliament or monarchy, like the one they had just declared their independence from. They were still very separated geographically. There were few roads, some crude maritime routes, no telephones, no railroads, etc. Populous regions along the coast were the centers for governance and trade, though population had begun to spread westward. Yet the western areas are loosely populated and often settled by poor, uneducated farmers. So it was in the coastal centers of society, such as Charleston, where state representatives were very familiar and highly accountable. And that stood in stark contrast to the English Parliament across the ocean. Colonists were enjoying very local governance. The Continental Congress, again formed by delegates from the separate states, wrote our first national governing document called the Articles of Confederation. And those articles governed our nation for about 8 years, including the years of the American Revolution. The Articles of Confederation provided for only one branch of national government, a legislative branch, that would continue to be called the Continental Congress. There was no court system. There was no president of the United States. There was just a president, or really just a chairperson of the Continental Congress, and he had no real power. The Continental Congress named George Washington the commander of the Continental Army, but the Articles of Confederation did not give Washington the power to raise and pay an army. So the Continental Army was really just the standing militia from a few of these new states who agreed to follow Washington's leadership. The Articles of Confederation gave the Continental Congress only the authority it needed to negotiate with foreign countries to engender aid and support for fighting the revolution. The Continental Congress could not force men to serve in the army, could not tax citizens in order to have income to pay for the soldiers. So the national government was very weak and very broke, and it is truly a miracle that our nation survived the revolution intact. But once it ended, in 1787, the Continental Congress gathered again to reconsider the structure of our American government. The Articles of Confederation had been so ineffective during the Revolution that most felt America needed a stronger national government. But how much stronger? That was the subject of great dispute. The Articles of Confederation required a unanimous vote to make amendments to it, and there was little hope of any unanimity on the issue of federalism. So the Continental Congress instead invited delegates from all the interested states to come to Philadelphia and write an entirely new document. And that new document became the U.S. Constitution of 1789. The U.S. Constitution is the document that established our federal government. In itself, the document is not law in the sense that it might guide the resolution of disputes or the punishment of crimes. Instead, it provides for the structure and power of the federal government. The Constitution is where the rule of law became an entrenched principle of our nation. The law, not any king, not any president, the law governs humankind. Unlike the Articles of Confederation, the structure of government under the Constitution took the form of 3 separate co-equal branches whose powers are defined in 7 articles. Article 1 forms the legislative branch, Article 2 forms the executive branch, and Article 3 forms the judicial branch. Each of the articles of the U.S. Constitution are important, but the first 3 are the primary source of power for the 3 branches of our national government, and we will focus our attention on just them. The U.S. Constitution, unlike the Articles of Confederation, can be changed by a majority, a 3/4 majority of ratifying states. This is a way that constitutional law may change. If the Constitution is amended, the law of its interpretation will change accordingly. So if you're using the guiding questions I suggested earlier in this lecture, how does constitutional law change? 1, on the very, very rare occasion that the U.S. Supreme Court overrules itself, or 2, on the very rare occasion that the U.S. Constitution is amended. The U.S. Constitution is not and was never meant to be an exhaustive list of individual rights. The original, unamended Constitution contained a few protections for individual rights, such as the writ of habeas corpus, prohibitions on bills of attainder, and the prohibition on ex post facto laws. But by its nature, the U.S. Constitution is not detailed and is not meant to be a compilation of laws that govern our country. It is designed, or it was designed and is still designed to form our government and to provide limited authority to that government. Protections for the citizens of our nation come from the fact that ours is a limited government. Its power is limited to just what we authorized it to do in the Constitution. Remember, the people are sovereign. We hold inalienable rights endowed by our Creator. We cede only so much of our power to our government in the Constitution. Whatever we haven't ceded, we still have. That is the essence of American freedom, and that is the social contract of John Locke. I'm sure you all know that our Constitution doesn't end with just the first 7 articles that define the power of the federal government. There are, of course, amendments to the Constitution. But even these amendments are not meant to be an exhaustive list of individual rights. They're just a compilation of certain rights that our founders were able to agree upon. Remember, from the get-go, there was a difference of opinion in our founding years about how much power our national government would have. Many states were refusing to ratify the Constitution because it lacked specific protections for many individual rights. State constitutions included these protections, and many delegates wanted the national constitution to do so as well. They were known as the Anti-Federalists. But other delegates didn't think it was necessary to provide a list of individual rights because our national government was by nature a government of limited powers. If the Constitution did not authorize the national government to censor our speech, then it couldn't do so, simply put. So why have a First Amendment that protected speech? People who felt that way were known as Federalists. But the Federalists needed the support of the Anti-Federalists to ratify the Constitution. So James Madison and other Federalists promised that they would write a bill offering greater protection for individual rights. Simultaneously with the ratification of the original Constitution, Congress submitted the Bill of Rights to the states for ratification as the first 10 amendments to the Constitution. The Bill of Rights apply to just the national government, not the states. That is a very important point for you to remember. At the time our nation was founded, no one feared state governments the way they feared the national government. State governments enjoyed home rule and high accountability. The protection that the states wanted was protection of rights against encroachment by the federal government. So now I'll go through each of the 10 amendments to the Bill of Rights. First Amendment. Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof, or abridging the freedom of speech or of the press, or the right of the people peaceably to assemble and to petition the government for a redress of grievances. So the First Amendment outlines 6 rights that fit neatly into 3 categories: religion, expression, and association. Religion was a big deal to early America, both in terms of practicing one's faith and in keeping government separate. Several colonies were founded specifically for the purpose of practicing one's faith free of the king's control. They did not want a central national government, akin to a king or parliament, to dictate what religion the whole nation would practice. So they ratified 2 rules. 1, there would be a wall of separation between church and state. This is known as the Establishment Clause that you see in the First Amendment. And it means that there would be no established religion. We're keeping government out of religion and religion out of government. The second rule is that individuals may practice his or her faith freely without government interference. This is known as the Free Exercise Clause of the First Amendment. The next category of rights in the First Amendment pertain to the freedom of expression. The First Amendment protects our right to speak our minds as individuals, as groups, and even as a press, the TV news, radio news, and internet news. This freedom is one of the very most powerful checks that we have on the power of the federal government. The last category of rights in the First Amendment is freedom of association. People have the right to come together to exercise their free speech rights, and when doing so, to complain about the government and insist that it make changes. This is another important way that we, the people, can check the power of our elected officials. The Second Amendment. A well-regulated militia, being necessary to the security of a free state, the right of the people to keep and bear arms shall not be infringed. So this is a strangely worded amendment. Only recently has it been interpreted with any degree of uniformity. The prefatory clause, a well-regulated militia being necessary to the security of a free state, that prefatory clause yields 2 very reasonable, valid arguments about the interpretation of the Second Amendment. The first interpretation is that the Second Amendment just protects the rights of a state to arm its militia. And that would be a vestige of the historical concerns that the states had about trading one tyrannical federal government for another. Keep in mind, when the Constitution was written, states feared that if they gave the federal government too much power, it would take away the states' arms, which at that time were just crude rifles and muskets. So the states would not be able to arm their militias and would be unable to maintain their state sovereignty. Well, that's the argument for the first interpretation. But there's another. The second interpretation is that the Second Amendment was an effort to entrench the notion that an individual has a right to protect him or herself by the use of arms, whatever that word means. Now, currently, the second interpretation is the interpretation that the U.S. Supreme Court holds. But what hasn't been made clear is the extent to which government may regulate guns. So far, the rule is that the government cannot outright ban the ownership of guns, but the Second Amendment does not forbid the regulation of arms. So most of the debate that currently occurs is about the scope of the regulations. The Third Amendment. No soldier shall, in time of peace, be quartered in any house without the consent of the owner, nor in time of war, but in manner to be prescribed by law. So before and during the American Revolution, English required colonists to give quarter to the soldiers sent to the colonies. All that meant was that English troops could stay in the homes of just regular citizens. And then the citizens had to let them do that to live with them. And they also had to feed them and provide for them. Well, the colonists were promised by the British government that they would be reimbursed, but they didn't. And that made the colonists quite mad at the British government. So the Third Amendment made that hated practice unconstitutional. So this amendment is really just a reflection of historical concerns that no longer exist. The Fourth Amendment. The right of the people to be secure in their persons, houses, papers, and effects against unreasonable searches and seizures shall not be violated, and no warrants shall issue, but upon probable cause, supported by oath or affirmation, and particularly describing the place to be searched, and the persons or things to be seized. This is one of the three main sources of due process rights in the Constitution. The Fourth Amendment provides restrictions on the power of the federal government to search or seize a person or his property or her property. It is the origin of the requirement of probable cause and warrants. The Fourth Amendment is also the source of implied rights, namely the right of privacy. We'll discuss implied rights a little later in the chapter, and we'll study search and seizure law in great depth in Chapter 6. But for now, just recognize that this amendment was a reaction to the custom of the English government to obtain general warrants, where they could search the home of a person for pretty much anything. Americans wanted to prevent that from continuing, and required warrants had to describe the scope of the search with particularity. The Fifth Amendment. No person shall be held to answer for a capital or otherwise infamous crime unless on a presentment or indictment of a grand jury, except in cases arising in the land or naval forces or in the militia, when in actual service in time of war or public danger. Nor shall any person be subject for the same offense to be twice put in jeopardy of his life or limb, nor shall be compelled in any criminal case to be a witness against himself, nor be deprived of life, liberty, or property without due process of law, nor shall private property be taken for public use without just compensation. So the Fifth Amendment then is another source of due process rights that we'll study in greater depth later. I've listed the 5 rights here so that you would just have a clear list of them. The grand jury indictment, protection against double jeopardy, the privilege against self-incrimination, undefined due process protection, which has procedural and substantive elements that we'll go over a little later, and the takings clause. The government cannot take private property without paying for it. This actually happens surprisingly often, particularly by local governments who want to get rid of blight, like rundown areas, to make the community more attractive to new business or boost property values. So the government has to pay the reasonable market value of private property that is condemned. The Sixth Amendment. In all criminal prosecutions, the accused shall enjoy the right to a speedy and public trial by an impartial jury of the state and district wherein the crime shall have been committed, which district shall have been previously ascertained by law, and to be informed of the nature and cause of the accusation, to be confronted with the witnesses against him, to have compulsory process for obtaining witnesses in his favor, and to have the assistance of counsel for his defense. Here's the source of very many due process rights. A speedy trial, well, that generally is about 100 days, but no specific time frame is listed in the Constitution. So it's really just measured on a case-by-case basis. And I can assure you now with COVID, it is no longer 100 days. It's very slow. That's just because we can't impanel juries quite so easily. The second right is the right to a public trial. Then notice of the charges against you. So there's no secrecy in law enforcement, or shouldn't be. The right to an impartial jury. Now that doesn't mean it's a right to have a jury completely unaware of the case. It simply means that the jurors have not yet formed an opinion on the defendant's guilt or innocence. The right to confront witnesses, which just means the right to take depositions or cross-examine the prosecution's witnesses. The right to compel witnesses, which means the defendant can issue subpoenas that will require witnesses to appear at trial and testify. And last, the very important right to the assistance of counsel, which has been interpreted to mean the effective assistance of counsel at the government's expense. The Seventh Amendment, in suits at common law, where the value in controversy shall exceed $20, the right of a trial by jury shall be preserved, and no fact tried by a jury shall be otherwise re-examined in any court of the United States than according to the rules of the common law. This amendment provides the right to a jury trial in federal court, and this would have been a pretty big deal to Americans having just thrown off a tyrannical British government. So federal judges, unlike state judges or some state judges, federal judges are appointed by the president, and they serve for life or good behavior. They are not elected, so they don't answer to anyone really. And this amendment then makes sure that there is still local control, a local jury involved in the federal court system. The Eighth Amendment, excessive bail shall not be required, nor excessive fines imposed, nor cruel and unusual punishments inflicted. So here's the protection against cruel and unusual punishment. It does not ensure that a defendant will be given bail, but it is an attempt to prevent outrageous amounts and punishments that are considered cruel or unusual, which is something of a moving target. What is defined as cruel and unusual has changed over the past 240 years. We've come a long way, but this is the source of protection against it. And really the main idea by the Eighth Amendment is that there would be proportionality in punishment. And I hope you remember that idea, proportionality in punishment, well, it started with the Magna Carta in 1215, and it's made its way all the way to the U.S. Constitution here. The Ninth Amendment, the enumeration in the Constitution of certain rights shall not be construed to deny or disparage others retained by the people. This is an expression of the notion of natural law or natural rights, and it accommodates some of the fears that by listing rights in our Constitution, we are somehow listing all the rights that exist. This amendment reminds the people that the Constitution does not create law. It simply limits the power of government. So if the Bill of Rights is not an exhaustive list of our inalienable rights, what other rights are there? Well, this amendment is a place where the Supreme Court could have operated to protect additional rights, such as privacy or abortion or same-sex marriage, assisted suicide. But instead, the Supreme Court has endeavored to define these other individual rights by basing them in custom and tradition and history, and asserting the Fifth Amendment's protection against deprivation of liberty as the source of protection for these unidentified rights. We'll talk about that a little bit more, but that process is called substantive due process. It's something a little different than procedural due process, but we'll go over that in a few minutes. And last, the 10th Amendment. The powers not delegated to the United States by the Constitution, nor prohibited by it to the states, are reserved to the states respectively, or to the people. This amendment addresses the concern that some states had about the federal government becoming a threat to state sovereignty. As I've mentioned several times before in this lecture, at the time of ratification, state governments were very concerned about local rule. They liked governors who were directly accountable, people they knew and saw regularly. This amendment emphasizes the point that the Constitution has created a limited government, a government whose powers are limited to just what is enumerated in the Constitution. So that is a brief overview of the first 10 amendments to the U.S. Constitution. As you saw in the video, these amendments were the bargaining chip for ratification of the Constitution. Had they not been submitted, the original Constitution would not have been ratified. So even though they are technically amendments, they didn't really change anything in the original Constitution. They simply added some assurance that our government would not overreach. The whole process of creating the U.S. Constitution was a compromise. The interest of competing ideologies had to be accommodated. Keep in mind also that the Bill of Rights only applies to the federal government. States are not prohibited from infringing on free speech or the practice of religion. States could ban guns. States could issue general warrants. The Bill of Rights do not protect citizens against overreaching state governments. That is because the states had their own constitutions already. State constitutions came first, and much of the U.S. Constitution was drawn from the state constitutions. So when I said that states are not prohibited from infringing on speech or the practice of religion, etc., it's just that the U.S. Constitution does not prohibit it, or didn't originally. State constitutions did have many of the same rights that are in the Bill of Rights and protected them against infringement by state governments. But just keep in mind that that's separate. The Bill of Rights only applied to the federal government. So if states were infringing on rights, at least at this time when the Constitution was ratified, if states were doing these things, they would have to answer to their state constitution. It's something a little different. And last, I want you to remember that none of the rights in the Bill of Rights are absolute. Our society tolerates limits on speech. It tolerates some regulation of the practice of religion, and it tolerates regulation of gun ownership. There are a lot of exceptions and limitations for when our rights can be infringed somewhat. And it is the extent of that infringement or the extent of that regulation that much of U.S. constitutional law pertains. It's all about balancing government power with individual rights. There are 27 amendments to the U.S. Constitution, and we've just covered 10 of them. There are 3 other amendments that we will review now, but first I need to place them in context. So the concerns for state sovereignty did not simply fade away after the ratification of the Bill of Rights. States' rights remained a rallying cry. Our nation was expanding westward very quickly. New states were joining the Union, and they were sending representatives to Congress advocating diverse economic interests. During the 1830s and 1850s, or to the 1850s, the industrial boom began, and yet the South stuck to its agricultural cash crop economy. As a consequence, slavery became the most important states' rights issue in politics. Slaves were essential to the success of the Southern economy, and representatives from Southern states were intent upon sustaining it and spreading it westward. States' rights, the nullification crisis, and secession led us into the Civil War. Following the Civil War, the federal government became the protector of former slaves. Radical Republicans in Congress held a great deal of power and control. The governments of former Confederate states were intent upon reinstating slavery-like conditions to maintain their cash crop economy. And for this reason, Congress, again, now populated by a political party called the Radical Republicans, Congress passed a number of constitutional amendments that were intended to protect former slaves. These amendments became known as the Reconstruction Amendments because of their timing and focus. It was during the Reconstruction era, and it was to force former Confederate states to extend equal rights to former slaves in exchange for their readmission to the Union. So you have three, right? It's the 13th Amendment, which abolished slavery, the 14th Amendment, which made African Americans, or simply recognized something that should have always been true, recognized that African Americans are citizens of the United States. So it's giving or making clear that African Americans would enjoy equal protection. They would enjoy due process. All the rights that are granted in the Constitution also are granted to African Americans. So in essence, it's putting into law that American dream, the ideal of equality. It applies to all persons. And it gave Congress the authority to enact laws that carry out these equal protection and due process guarantees. And we'll talk about those laws a little bit later. And last, by the 15th Amendment, of African Americans are granted the right to vote. These Reconstruction Amendments were very specifically and intended to apply to state governments. So whereas the Bill of Rights very specifically and intentionally applied just to the federal government, the 14th Amendment, the 13th Amendment, 14th Amendment, and 15th Amendment are written to protect rights as against the state governments, particularly the former Confederate states. The Reconstruction Amendments, particularly the 14th Amendment, is broadly worded and doesn't reference freedom of speech or probable cause or search and seizure limitation. So how can state governments be held accountable for violating these rights that are enumerated only in the Bill of Rights? Well, the answer to that question starts with the similarity in language between the 5th and the 14th Amendment, and that's what I've put up here on the slide. Because of their common language, you see it italicized here, both amendments say, without due process of law. Okay, out of that common language, they developed a constitutional principle known as selective incorporation. And the textbook, in my opinion, confuses the heck out of that concept. So I want you to just ignore that and listen to what I have to say, because it's really not that complicated. The language of the 14th Amendment reads, "Nor shall any state deprive any person of life, liberty, or property without due process of law." It is the mirror image of the 5th Amendment in the Bill of Rights. So what is due process law specifically, if not the rights outlined in the Bill of Rights? On a case-by-case basis, the U.S. Supreme Court has recognized that fact. It has interpreted this language from the 14th Amendment, which does apply to states, to include those rights protected by the Bill of Rights. But again, this happens on a case-by-case basis, an amendment-by-amendment basis, a right-by-right basis. For example, there's a case, it's called Mapp versus Ohio. I think it's in your textbook. And in that case, the U.S. Supreme Court held that the 4th Amendment's requirement of a search warrant was a due process right protected also by the 14th Amendment. So they have selected, so it's selective incorporation. The U.S. Supreme Court has selected this right to have a search warrant and incorporated it into the due process language of the 14th Amendment. So they're selecting it and incorporating it, selecting it and incorporating it on a right-by-right basis. And I think there may be only 2, if that, rights that are protected as against the federal government that have not yet been selectively incorporated through the 14th Amendment so as to be protected against state government infringement. But the lion's share of those individual rights are now incorporated into the 14th Amendment through this process of selective incorporation. So let's recap just for a second. Constitutional law is judge-made law that interprets the language of the Constitution. Constitutional law cases involve disputes over the assertion of government power that might infringe upon the exercise of individual rights. The outcome of those cases is controlled by the supreme law of the land, the U.S. Constitution. Constitutional law rarely changes. It is possible that the Supreme Court will overrule itself, but that doesn't happen often. And additionally, constitutional law can be changed by an amendment to the U.S. Constitution, but again, that is very, very unlikely. The Constitution is connected to other forms of law, one of which we've already discussed. Some common law principles made their way into the U.S. Constitution, as we saw with the rule of law and checks on the power of government. The starkest connection, though, is between constitutional law and legislation, which is the next form of law that I will discuss in the third part of the lecture for Chapter 3. So now you have your second video to watch, which will elaborate upon the material I just lectured on. Go into the agenda for this week, and you'll follow the link to view a video called The Story of the Bill of Rights.